I think you've all probably met me, but in case anybody's watching this on YouTube afterwards, watching the recording, my name is Neve Hannon, and my background is I'm a chartered counselling psychologist, 25 years now. I also work as a coach. I have an interest in emotional intelligence, and I'm certified in the EQI 2.0 assessment. And I've worked with, I suppose I worked as a therapist for 20 years. And then since 2020, I've been working as a coach. I don't offer therapy anymore. For the last 14 months, I've been working part-time, 2 days a week, as a wellness coach for Centric Mental Health, supporting Meta, Facebook people. And I've been training with Dr. Lola Gershfeld in the States, in California, in her approach called EMC, Emotional Connection. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today under the topic of transforming workplace relationships. So what is EMC, or emotional connection, that I'm talking about here? Really, the EMC strategy is centered around the systematic exploration of emotions. So it's all about I suppose, recognizing that work emotions do happen in the workplace, and that often it's these very emotions that we think don't belong in the workplace that are getting in the way of our ability to be productive, or, getting in the way of performance, because there's so much stress, there's so much uncertainty and volatility. And we're focusing in particular on workplace relationships and dynamics. So when these emotions can be understood and addressed, when you give people the tools to understand them, then people can work to create emotional safety in the workplace. And we know there's been so much research done on psychological safety, and the importance of it in the workplace. So this really speaks to that. It's really about recognizing and helping people with those relationships and creating safety, so that people feel safe to just be themselves and bring themselves to work. And then they can work to their full potential. So EMC has been developed over the past 15 years by Dr. Gershfeld. But in Europe, I'm the first to have studied it to this level and to be bringing it and introducing it. So there's a lot of work to do in just letting people know about it, first of all. So I just introduce or let somebody in there. So it's in that sense, it's a newly evolving but very structured approach. And I think that structure is part of what gives it a lot of its. So it supports those work or team relationships. Hi, Karine, you're very welcome. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just muting because there's some background noise. Thank you. So it's very much based on attachment theory and the science of emotional connection. So it is science-based. Dr. Gershfeld has books written on the topic, and there are case studies available. So there's lots of more information, but I want to give you today some kind of introduction to the topic, and some understanding of it, and hopefully give you something useful to kind of get you to bring back to your own work. So it really is about helping team members, getting them back to positive communication. And communication is such a huge, vast area. Obviously, we could cover assertiveness in one day, you could cover it as something else, but this is about focusing on the emotional content of and how we impact on others, because that's one of the things that people are really not very aware about in the workplace, is how they impact on others. And so this focuses on the emotional message that team members send to each other and the bond that they create. And it's about giving people the tools, so it's very practical, to build and repair workplace relationships even after conflict. So it's about recognizing that disconnections and conflict do occur in the workplace. Anybody I speak to has experienced conflict in the workplace. So just letting somebody else in there. Okay. I'm hoping. Okay, yes, I have several people who so let me just pause that there. Okay. Okay. Oh, here's people arriving now. You couldn't make this up, could you? Technology, the fun of it. Okay. Okay. So just to give you a very brief little background on some of the science behind this emotional connection approach to transforming workplace relationships. So first of all, if we look at the brain and a little bit of neuroscience, the amygdala is the center of emotions. So it's a very old part of the brain. And what's interesting, I think, and what's kind of necessary to understand is that the amygdala can override any other part of the brain, but other parts of the brain cannot override the amygdala. Okay. Now, when we get disconnected or we're in conflict and we're fired up emotionally, that's our amygdala. Okay. Our amygdala is hijacked, we often call it at that point, where it's we're in a highly aroused emotional situation. And basically at that point, our emotions are in the driving seat. So our logical reasoning is in the back seat. Okay. So your logical reasoning mind cannot override those emotions once the amygdala is fired up. That's really important. Your emotions can override your logical reasoning, but your logical reasoning part of the brain in the prefrontal cortex cannot override the amygdala. Though those directions are going one way. It's a one-way system. So that's why if you're dealing with somebody who's highly irate or irritated or frustrated or stressed or overwhelmed or any of those kind of emotions, you could try and talk sense to them, but until you calm them down, no amount of sense is going to go in because the logical reasoning part of their brain cannot be accessed as long as they're fired up. Okay. So that's something that we really need to understand, because when we go into a disconnect situation where we feel disconnected from somebody important, that starts triggering our amygdala hijack. And that means that we can no longer really function the way we might like to. And that means that our emotions can kind of influence us to act in ways that we, might otherwise might be against our better judgment, or we might say something or behave in a way that we wouldn't if we were feeling calm and connected and safe in the situation. Okay, I hope that makes a little bit of sense. So we can't just logic our way out of emotions, in other words, right? So that's really important. And so you can see there the it's not necessarily anatomically perfect, but that little diagram, but the amygdala can override the other parts of the brain and impact on them when it's fired up. But, your prefrontal cortex, which is where you have your, impulse control and your executive functioning, that doesn't override and cannot override the amygdala. Okay. So that's really important understanding, I think, of how we work as human beings. To those of you who came in, thank you so much for joining. My sincere apologies. It must have been kind of a faulty link sent out. So I'm glad that you were able to join us. So if we look at the psychology, the key lens here to look through is through attachment theory. And so you may or may not be familiar with attachment theory. It's become more popular again in recent years. You see it a lot on Facebook or Instagram if you're on it, particularly if you're looking at relationship stuff. But it was originally developed by John Bowlby in the 1950s, really. And there was research done with Marie Ainsworth. And they really, so Bowlby really explained attachment theory as being, about how our attachment, our very first attachment to our primary caregiver, usually the mum, certainly in the 1950s, as a baby, that creates a template for our relationships in later life. So on as a baby, we're totally dependent on our caregivers. And so attachment may help us to actually survive. And so those early bonds kind of serve as a template. Now, it's not irreversible. Like anything, we understand much more nowadays than in the 50s about the neuroplasticity of the brain. Um, but I suppose suffice to say that their research showed that nurturance and responsiveness were the primary determinants of attachment. So a nurturing parent for the baby, and but also responsiveness. That if the baby cried because they needed their nappy changed or they're hungry, that those needs would be responded to, and in that way, the baby learns that the world is a safe place and that my needs will be met. Whereas if a child is neglected, for example, or left for extra long periods of time to cry it out, and they're left in a wet nappy or they're starving, then they may learn that the world is not so trustworthy. Or if they have a parent who sometimes dotes on them and other times rejects them and treats them coldly or avoids them, then they may learn that the world is unpredictable and therefore unsafe. And that's how they then I suppose, expect other people to behave, and that serves as that template then. And their behavior can often impact on that. So there's different types of attachment, like there's secure attachment and different types of insecure attachment. But for the purposes of emotional connection, you don't need to go into the ins and outs so much about which type of insecure attachment are you, or are you securely attached. So but it's really important to understand that secure attachment is what's important. So if we start applying this to the workplace now, work relationships are actually attachment bonds. We don't think of them in that way, but this is what we're saying here, that the people that we depend on, and particularly in work, our boss and our closest colleagues with whom we have to collaborate. Those relationships in particular are attachment bonds. And so we develop those because of our dependency on each other. And if there's a lack of safety, or if one of those bonds is threatened, then that feels like a threat to us, to our safety, and to our being. Okay. So it's particularly strong with the manager direct report relationship. That is an extremely important relationship. And if that it and yourselves, like you've seen it in your own workplaces or people that you work with, that where that relationship goes wrong, that's for 75% of the time, that's the reason somebody leaves their job. It's because of that relationship. So it's really, really important. So when an employee feels a secure attachment with their boss, with whoever they report to, their manager, then they feel more comfortable in their own skin and more comfortable to be themselves. And they're also, research has shown, likely to be perceived as being a valuable contributing member of the team. Whereas when that attachment is not secure, or where there's damaged, then what matters really is the repair of those moments of disconnect. So just to differentiate between conflict and disconnect, very often in the workplace, there is conflict and it's outright, but there's also a lot of stuff that goes on that people don't necessarily label as conflict, and it can be way more implicit because we like to keep up a professional veneer and we know how we should behave in the workplace. So very often there's what we call a disconnect happening. And that disconnect is when literally that kind of attachment cord is snipped, where we feel disconnected from the other person. And most often, this is triggered by a look or a tone of voice. It can be a particular look that somebody gives you, or it can be a particular tone of voice that triggers that disconnect, where you start unconsciously even to kind of step back a little, there's something wrong here. Okay. And so those kind of disconnects are happening all the time. So I just want to normalize disconnection, because even with, it doesn't matter if you were married for 20 years, you are still having disconnections with the person that you love most in your life. We all are experiencing disconnections all the time. Think of, and again, it's very often tone of voice, or, you know, somebody gives you a particular look, and you could start your day off that way, and you're irritated by them, or feel like they're getting at you, or hurt by them. Um, and that can build then and create further issues within the relationship if it's not repaired and if it's not caught. So the earlier you can catch these things really and repair them with that awareness and with the know-how, then the better it is for the relationship. And actually, you can create a stronger relationship that way. So I would see this as being applicable, like wherever people work with people, but even in the home and in other situations where it's not necessarily workplace. So managers and employees can learn the process of reconnection, which is essentially a two-step process. It's helping each other to slow down and recognize what's happening, recognize that you're in a negative cycle, and that's another part of this, is like, it's not about finger pointing and, oh, you said this and he said this and you made this, made me feel. It's about, okay, there's something happening in the space between us. We call that the negative cycle. And when we can become aware and kind of catch on that there's a negative cycle happening, then we can begin to repair it. So that helps us to reach for each other and re-engage. So I know there's a lot of different conflict resolution approaches out there. There's mediation is very successful, but very often in the workplace, things have got very far before they get to mediation, and so the difference of this approach perhaps is it's about, you can use it when things have got far, and it will help you to repair after even severe conflict. But ideally, you're teaching people so it's more proactive, giving them the skills to prevent conflict happening. Okay. So some of the emotions that come up in the workplace that we may not recognize as commonly being there are fear and shame. They tend to come up quite quickly and erode job performance. Like, common fears would be, am I going to meet the expectations of my boss? Are they going to think that I screwed up? Or am I going to be the next one to go? That kind of insecurity when there's a lot of volatility. When these difficult emotions come up for us, it can be very hard to recognize. We're not necessarily very aware of, you know, or, or able to differentiate between the different emotions that we experience. So we might just feel stressed, for example, or feel annoyed or feel hurt, but we're not necessarily able to kind of differentiate between all the bundle of emotions that are going on for us, or what the source of that even was. So another feeling that can arise in the workplace is sadness, but mostly when a conflict arises, there's fear, because there's a fear of that disconnection. There's a kind of an anxiety, even if you're not an anxious person at all, or you're normally quite secure and confident. When we experience that disconnect, there's a fear response, and sometimes a shame response too, because we don't know how to go into those feelings in a safe way. So when you can begin to understand this, you can shape things. So part of the process, and I'll just show you actually the reconnection process is a very structured process. Literally bring people through, pen and paper or on screen, down through a set process. So it's not asking people, how do you feel, that dreaded question where they're supposed to pull some emotion out of the air. That's too difficult for people, and they're not comfortable doing that, certainly in the workplace. But when you've got a list of emotions up in front of them and you're helping them to identify, okay, so and we differentiate here between surface emotions, which are the ones that are kind of visible to others, like irritation, frustration, annoyance. They're often the layer or the level of emotions that we're aware of. So I might be aware that I'm annoyed and irritated. Okay. The next level down is the softer emotions. So they're the more vulnerable emotions that happen under the surface. And they're the trickier ones that people are usually not so aware of and not so tuned into, because it might feel safer for them just to stay in the annoyance and anger and irritation rather than feeling, very vulnerable or maybe humiliated or, totally disconnected and unsafe. So you're helping people to recognize what's really feeding that irritation that's happening on the surface, what's really going on for them at that softer level. And then underneath that, there's the primary emotion, which is, feeding into all of these. And so fear and shame and sadness are some of the key primary emotions. This process is designed to help calm down the amygdala. So by bringing somebody through the process, you are being heard and you're being acknowledged, and your feelings are too. And that creates safety. And that process that you're bringing them through calms down the amygdala so that then you can begin to reconnect with the other person. Okay. They can't do that if they haven't felt heard in their whatever they're experiencing. So this is the negative cycle that we identify as part of this process. So first of all, it's about identifying, okay, what was the trigger? What triggered me? Was it, something that was said? Was it the tone of voice? Was it like, maybe I went into my boss and I just had a simple question, and my boss replied in a particular tone of voice, and that triggered me, feeling like, that they didn't want me there and they're dismissing or they're judging me for having a question. And so in my head, then I'm thinking, oh, geez, I can't even ask a question, or they're biting my head off. Maybe all that was happening for my boss is that they'd come off a difficult call, or they're under pressure themselves, and so their tone came across wrong. But if I'm triggered, then, it's hitting off some raw spots for me. So it's about recognizing what are those, what's going on for me on the surface, what are my emotions. There's automatic thoughts that happen, like, I need to get out of here, or I have to stop them, or whatever, maybe they don't care. And then I'll have protective behaviors. So those protective behaviors tend to kind of go in one of two directions. One person, or very often there's one of each. There's the pursuer and there's a withdrawer. Okay, that's the most common kind of cycle that we get into. And the pursuer, their protective behaviors tend to be, they come across as blame, judgment, criticism, for example. So the pursuer is usually like, why don't you answer me? Why don't you tell me what's going on? I've sent you 3 emails. Why haven't I got anything from you? We need to talk. Okay. That's the pursuer type behavior. The withdrawer, then, their behavior is more that they avoid, shut down, withdraw. So each of those, I think of it like Pac-Man. You've got the pursuer kind of chasing and the withdrawer moving away, because as the withdrawer senses the pursuit happening, they withdraw more. And as the pursuer senses somebody kind of moving away, they pursue more. So you're usually more commonly one or the other, but you'll probably possibly change depending on the relationship too. Okay. So you're helping people to recognize what their type of behavior is. Very often, say, for example, if I'm a pursuer, if that's my protective behavior, that's likely to trigger the other person then, and then you're going around into their negative cycle, and each is re-triggering the other. So I'm hoping this makes a little bit of sense. If you've got any questions, because I'm just conscious of time, if you've got any questions, even note them down. I can come back to this later and answer questions for you at the end. We'll have some discussion time. So part of the whole reconnection process is recognizing what's happening in the negative cycle. So you're building awareness and emotional intelligence as you're bringing people through this very structured process. Okay. So when this is practiced and repeated, so when we have if you were using this every time you experienced a disconnect with somebody that's important to you, you would be becoming more and more aware of your own emotions, your own automatic thoughts, your kind of protective behavior patterns, and your raw spots. And in fact, over time, it has been shown that your raw spots and your likelihood of being triggered actually decrease then, so we become more robust and more resilient in that sense, because our empathy is also growing and our understanding of the type of situation is growing. So we're less likely to be triggered by the same amount of things. So those disconnections are often triggered by fear of rejection or abandonment, at their very core. Fear of failure, really. Fear of not measuring up, not, you're somebody thinking that you're not good enough. That's a really common one. Another really common one is, not feeling valued, not feeling appreciated. Here am I trying so hard and putting in so much effort, and, you're not noticing, you're not valuing me. Could be fear of being controlled or misjudged. It could be fear of being dismissed or treated unfairly, or being seen as incompetent in some way. They're very common in a workplace situation. So if we pull back now and look at the state of the workplace, recent 2024 research by Gallup would show that we have maybe, if we're lucky, about 33% of the workforce who are engaged. About 51%, so that's 1 in 2 people, are not engaged, and 16% are actively disengaged and probably, applying for other jobs, going for interviews. So that's not a good snapshot really for any organization. A snapshot of the daily negative emotions experienced a lot of the previous day: stress 49%, anger 17%, sadness 21%, and loneliness 18%. I think that loneliness figure is interesting because when people are working remotely in particular, it can be lonely and disconnecting for people. During COVID, when everybody suddenly and rapidly went remote, managers were very concerned about people's well-being. So they were reaching out and trying to have a one-on-one with everybody in their team once a week, so that there was that connection. There was a sense that, you care about me. Okay. That has definitely dropped. Everything has got so busy again. Managers are just trying to do their job. We see, unless somebody's reporting an issue or creating a problem, then those one-on-one times are not really happening as much, I think, in a lot of organizations. And so people are feeling lonely. They're not feeling as much a part of their team. So that's a disconnect in itself. And of course, any kind of sadness, anger, stress, they're all emotions that we experience when we're feeling disconnected. In other research, the CPP Global Human Capital Report 2022 showed that the average person spends, and it's moved from 3 hours per person per week or per employee per week up to 4.2. So we're all spending an average of 4.2 hours per week dealing with conflict. And if you have a team of 10 people, then that's 40 hours a week gone within your team alone on conflict. So that's a full-time salary being wasted on conflict in the workplace. So you can begin to see just the expense of this. That's with a team of maybe 10 people. If you're in a large organization where you've maybe thousands working, then it's a massive, massive cost. And it has increased. It has got worse. So even though there are a lot of approaches out there, the problem has got worse. So I really think this approach is needed. It offers something different. Okay. So the goal of emotional connection in this approach really is to empower managers and teams with tools to repair and nurture emotional safety. And that's done through learning self-awareness and signs of disconnection. And again, that's done through a very structured process, through recognizing that negative cycle and being able to call it out. So it's not like, blame and finger pointing or scapegoating as regularly happens in teams where one person is identified as the problem. And if only we could get rid of them, then we'd have a great team. This doesn't allow for that kind of scapegoating. It's about, okay, there's a relationship issue going on here. If somebody's performance has gone downhill, then it's not a pip that's needed. It's a reconnection. There's some disconnect happening. It's about, establishing a safe roadmap for repairing those kind of injuries that happen in relationships, nurturing relationships to foster resilience, and developing a culture of support. So that you increase positive interactions and thriving. So this has a big impact as well on well-being and for individuals, helping them to thrive. Because if you can create that secure base that they talk about in attachment, that secure base where somebody feels safe to just be themselves and bring themselves to work, then they can begin to work to their potential. So I would see it as having emotional connection, and I suppose this is why I was happy to get into this, because I'd have an interest in emotional intelligence and supporting the growth of emotional intelligence in leaders. And while there are brilliant assessments out there to tell you where you're at in your emotional intelligence and measures, there hasn't been a process to predictably improve emotional intelligence. And this gives you that process. It's a roadmap, essentially. Even for people who aren't coming forward to self-select for, okay, I'd like to build my emotional intelligence, which, how often does that happen? Through the use of this, you're growing emotional intelligence within teams, within the workplace. It's also, I would also come from a background of working in well-being for 20 years in corporates, and this, well, 25 years now, still supporting well-being and well-being on an ongoing basis. And this helps well-being, because if you feel supported, if you feel safe, if you feel like your manager or your leader is there for you, then that makes all the difference. It's a hugely positive impact. So yeah, so one structured approach can make a big difference. And when employees feel connected, the organisation directly benefits. So there's a reduction in absenteeism, there's a reduction in turnover. It's 21% for high turnover organisations and 51% reduction in turnover for lower turnover organisations. I'm thinking of some of the tech companies, for example. They're designed to have high turnover in some ways. That people come in every 2 years, maybe. There's growth then in positive outcomes, for example, customer engagement, productivity, profitability, of course, huge growth in well-being and participation in the organization. So that connection is really important. And again, that comes back to the attachment. So the more secure our workplace relationships are, then the better engagement, team performance, and growth will be. It affects the bottom line, but it also affects the whole atmosphere and culture of a place as well. So in a nutshell, emotional connection, EMC, helps organizations master the art of relationships. So it's all about transforming those workplace dynamics so that you spend less time dealing with the people issues and conflict and have more time to focus on the real work. And it does this in a couple of ways. There are, as I mentioned, the reconnection sessions where you bring people down through that structured reconnection process. So you're helping them to identify what caused the disconnect in the first place, what's happening in me, what's happening in the other person. And I talked a little bit earlier about identifying the surface emotions versus the softer emotions. When we are expressing, and I think this is really interesting because I worked for a therapist for 20 years and worked in emotions, but this approach really taught me something, because you're usually taught just to express your emotions is good, but when we express our surface emotions, we often push people away. Whereas when we can safely express our more vulnerable, softer emotions, then we pull people towards us. So when you can support the people that you're working with to express the more appropriate, vulnerable, then that opens up and helps people to really begin to feel each other, and get a feeling for each other. And it opens up that compassion and empathy. And they start to be able to hear what's going on for the other person rather than just having to defend their own place, because they also feel heard in themselves. Okay. And then you can begin to facilitate bonding conversations and rebuild and repair that relationship. So that's the reconnection sessions. And then there's also, of course, training. So it isn't just about going in and, running reconnections with people. It's also about training people in this so that they can do it for themselves. And you may, coach leaders to install the learnings over time so that they can lead teams who thrive. So that's it in a nutshell. I'm running Europe's first live EMC training next week on the 23rd and 24th in Dublin. So that's a 2 full day training. It's a 2.5 day training, 2 full days in person with a half day online a month later. And ongoing support where necessary. So all participants will also receive access to the online course for a year. So it's the masterclass certification trains you in that reconnection process. So you are trained to do those reconnection sessions with people in the workplace. And there'll be small numbers for maximum learning. So just wanted to let you know about that. It has been accredited by the Psychological Society of Ireland. It's also accredited for learning points by the International Coaching Federation. If you're US based, I don't think anybody here today is, although Lorna, you may be more working on US side of things. A lot of the HR professional bodies recognize this. So there's a list of those. I haven't shared them here because more people are interested in the European Irish side of things here. Yeah, and if you are a member in a different professional body, I can apply for accreditation for you. So definitely some of the benefits would be, it's really about resolving workplace conflict and increasing productivity, giving people the tools to deal with those difficult emotions that arise and difficult relationships. And, people so often come, can you help us out with how to manage challenging relationships, tricky relationships? They have all sorts of phrases and words for it, but everybody knows what we're talking about. It happens all the time in the workplace. It's about creating a psychologically safe environment to increase your team effectiveness. It's a way of addressing the anger, stonewalling, passive-aggressive behavior, and lack of trust that you can often see happening. It's a way to repair relationships and increase that emotional connection, and build agile teams that can evolve and change because they have that relational strength. They have a common language now. And it's like it takes the mess out of it, because it's like now we can just get on with the work because this solid base is there. And it develops an atmosphere that supports coaching and collaboration, and really supports leaders to be more present for their direct reports. So if you'd like to learn more, feel free to, email me and we'll jump on a call. There's also the parent website is emcleaders.com. There are there's case studies on that. There are resources on that. There's white papers. There's just so much information on the parent website that's US based. This is one of Dr. Lola Gershfeld's books, EMC Connection or Emotional Connections. That's available on Amazon. But if you Google Dr. Lola Gershfeld on Amazon, you'll see she has quite a few books, and one of them is another one is around having navigating difficult conversations. Okay,